Chapter 10 of the Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Debbie R. Baker Robinson. The Boy Scouts in the Maine Woods by Herbert Carter. Bare-faced Robbery in the Maine Woods. 3 men were bending over the dead deer, and all of them carried rifles. They were a rough-looking set, all told, and anyone would know at a glance that they could not be city sportsmen up here in the Maine woods on a hunt, but must belong to the native class of guides, loggers, or possibly something worse. One of them was in truth a giant, and as soon as Thad set eyes on this individual he knew that his worst fears were about to be realized. This could be no other than the big poacher, Old Cale Martin, the man whom the game wardens seemed to dread like poison, and had never yet dared arrest, though his breaking of the laws had become notorious all through that section where he roamed. Despite his sensation of acute alarm, Thad surveyed the man with more or less interest and curiosity. He had heard so much about his doings that he would have actually felt a certain degree of disappointment had he gone away from Maine and never met Cale Martin. Then what Jim Hasty had told him added to his desire to look upon the face of little Lena's awful father. No doubt Step Hen must also have jumped at some sort of right conclusion with regard to the identity of the 3 men. The unusual size of the leader was quite enough in itself to tell who they must be. Thad did not halt long upon sighting the others, but walked forward. Even though poachers, this did not mean that the 3 men were desperate outlaws by any means. No doubt they walked in and out of villages in this extreme northern section of the state, and were greeted by those who knew them as fellow guides, though seldom were any of them employed in such a capacity nowadays. Step Hen tagged at the heels of his chum. He did not know what Thad might be going to do, but although white of face just then, with a sudden fear of trouble, at least Step Hen showed no sign of running away. The 3 men looked up as the boys approached. All of them seemed to be grinning, as though amused. But while the big man really looked somewhat as a mastiff might appear to a little terrier, his 2 companions had a sneer on their dark, evil faces that gave Thad more or less uneasiness. He knew that while Step Hen was entitled to that fine buck, the chances were his claim would never be considered for a single minute. Might made right in the Maine woods, with men of this stamp. "Hello, younkers, lookin' arter your deer, eh?" remarked the giant, as the boys boldly approached. "Wall, thar hain't any, d'ye see? We gut a fine leetle buck here as Si fetched down with his big bore cannon. Only for him the deer's been in their next county afore now, eh, Si?" And the giant, as he said this, turned on the man who wore the greasy suit of buckskin, and sported a coonskin cap, after the style of the old-time hunters now so nearly extinct. "That's right, Cale. He'd a been agoin' like 240 yet, and only for the ounce of lead I throwed into him on the jump. I guess as how that leetle pepper box just tickled him a mite, and made him feel frisky. Step right up and take a look at my buck, if so be yer wanter, strangers. I hain't begrudgin' you that much conserlation. But don't you be sayin' you had any hand in knockin' him over, 'cause I don't stand for any foolishness, see?" He looked particularly ugly when saying this last, and Thad knew there was not the slightest shadow of a chance that they would get justice from these fellows. Seeing the sadly wounded deer plunging blindly toward them, Si had fired at the animal, and now they claimed to own the prize. Well, there was no use trying to make a fuss over it. 2 boys could hardly expect to overawe 3 such hardened woods rangers as these. Nevertheless, for his own satisfaction, Thad accepted the rude invitation of Si Kedge to advance closer, so that he could stand over the deer. Something caught his eye as he looked, and bending down, he deftly took the object from the motionless body of the deer, just back of the shoulder where a patch of blood appeared. Thad held the object up so that all could see. Even Step Hen recognized it as the mushroomed bullet that had been fired from his rifle. The evidence was as positive and clear as noonday, for that bullet, after spreading out, had bored completely through the body of the buck, and was ready to drop from the other side when it caught the sharp eye of Thad. And that other wound in the neck must have been where the boasted large caliber bullet from Si's big gun had gone, producing only a superficial hurt that would not have seriously inconvenienced the sturdy buck. "Oh, that's my bullet!" exclaimed Step Hen, hardly comprehending what a storm his words might bring about their ears. "And just as you said, Thad, I hit him in the side where his heart lies. That would have killed him in a short time, I just guess. Don't you, Thad?" But Thad did not make any answer. He was keeping his eyes on the three men, even while dropping the spread out bullet into his pocket to show it to Eli and Jim and Allan when they returned to camp, as proof that the glory of killing the fine 6-pronged buck really belonged to Step Hen. The giant actually gave a little chuckle. Evidently he admired the nerve shown by this half-grown lad; for like most big men, Cale Martin could on occasion exhibit a sense of generosity toward those smaller than himself. With just that brief chance to see what the three poachers looked like, Thad was able to size them up along different lines. He believed that Si and Ed were both shallow-brained bullies, with revengeful natures; but that Cale Martin, while known as a desperate man, was really more so through his association with such rascals as these than for any other cause. And Thad chanced to know just why he had doubly earned this reputation for ugliness during the last year or so. Jim Hasty's running away with his little girl Lina had been the last straw that broke the camel's back, since it had made Old Cale feel reckless, and as though he cared no longer for anything in this world. "What do you think of that, Si?" burst out the other fellow, who had not spoken up to now. "The pesky critter is a-claimin' as how his friends sent that bullet through their buck's ribs, when we all know 'tward from your gun." The shorter poacher gritted his teeth, and looked daggers at Thad. He even made a significant movement with his heavy rifle, which the boy saw was of the repeating pattern, and had the hammer raised at that moment. "I don't stand for any sech talk as that," he declared with savage energy; "and if their cubs knows what is good for 'em, they'll turn tail, and mosey outen this here region some quick. Scat now, and be mighty keerful how you start to claimin' a deer agin, what another man's shot. It's somethin' that ain't goin' to be allowed up here in the woods. I gives you fair warnin' to change base, and clar out." "Come on, Thad, let's move along," exclaimed Step Hen, who was white in the face, and trembling more or less. Of course the patrol leader was far too smart to think of trying to defy that ugly lot. At the same time Thad showed no sign of fear as he turned and gave the bully of the woods one sneering look, as though plainly telling him what he thought. Indeed, it seemed to stir the ire of the man who claimed to have killed the deer, for with a snort he started to throw up his gun, as if bent on threatening mischief, unless the boys ran in a hurry. But it was the hand of the giant that grasped the gun, and turned it aside. "Don't you try it, Si!" roared Old Cale. "We done enough as 'tis, takin' their game away from 'em without layin' a hand on their hides. But you'd better skip out, as Si says, younkers. And say, while I think o' it, just tell that sneak, Jim Hasty, fur me, that I'm goin' to keep my word about them ears o' his'n. I'll learn him what it means ter defy Old Cale Martin." For the life of him Thad could not help making some sort of reply to this. "I'll carry your message, just as you say," he went on; "but let me tell you right here and now, you never made a bigger mistake in your life when you called Jim Hasty a sneak or a coward. Would a coward dare come up here when he knew how you hated him, and had it in for him? I guess not much. Fact is, Jim's got a message for you. Somebody's sent him up here. And he meant to hunt you up and see you face to face. A coward? Well, I guess not." And without giving the giant a chance to say another word, Thad wheeled, striding away, with the nervous Step Hen at his side, casting many an anxious glance back over his shoulder, as though not quite convinced that the warlike Si might not think it best after all to shoot after them. But 10 minutes later, and the two boys were well away from the spot which had come very near looking upon a tragedy. "How do you feel about it now?" asked Thad. "What do you mean?" inquired the other. "I'm as sore as can be about losing my lovely 6-pronged buck, and knocked over all by myself, too. Wouldn't I just like to give it to that low-down liar of a Si Kedge, though, for saying that was his bullet, when anybody could see that it came from my rifle? Why, he only pinked the deer in the neck, because I could see the mark. Oh, the thieves, the miserable skunks, to cheat me out of my prize. I'll never get over this, Thad." "Oh, yes, you will, Step Hen," remarked the other soothingly, for he felt that the bare-faced robbery had been a terrible shock to his companion. But what I meant when I asked that was, do you want to head toward camp now? Have you had enough hunting for today?" "Now, I know you're saying that, Thad, just to let me down easy," declared the other. "I acknowledge that I was beginning to get tired, up to the time I killed that deer, but it's all passed away now. The excitement did it for me, and I've got my second wind." "Then you want to keep on hunting?" asked the scoutmaster, feeling that Step Hen was exhibiting considerable grit under the circumstances, and delighted to see the same brought out by the ill turn fortune had given him. "Sure I do," instantly replied the other. "I'm just wild to get another chance to knock over a 6-pronged buck, and now that I know the ropes, it's easy as falling off a log. Looks like this snow ain't a-going to amount to much, after all, and we've got pretty nearly half a day ahead of us yet. So let's keep on for a while. When I get a little tired, we'll stop to eat our snack of grub, when I can rest up and be ready for another hour or two. But I'm afraid my luck has turned, and we won't sight another deer this blessed day. Do you, Thad?" "We'll hope to, at any rate," replied the other, as he started off again. "And it's that constant expectation of starting up game that makes hunting all it's cracked up to be. So come along, Step Hen, and if we fail to bring in our share of venison, it won't be because we lay down too easy. Now for quiet again, remember, and keep a constant lookout ahead." End of chapter 10.